Hi folks, in this video we're going to be looking at making a super easy and super realistic swamp base. A lot of the swamp bases you see are quite flat and brown and lacking in vegetation, and swamps are actually quite fertile and lush. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out with, I'm going to be applying the muddy ground for this swamp base. And to do this, I'm using Stirland mud from Games Workshop, which is a medium brown texture paint. It doesn't matter the particular texture paint that you use if you're going to paint it brown later, but to make things nice and easy, I'd recommend starting out with a brown one. And when you're applying this texture paint, I'd recommend varying the thickness of the texture paint in areas. So some areas it's a bit more gloopy than others, and some it's barely covering the base. This will allow you for a variety in the amount of viscosity to the ground. And make sure that this texture paint has fully dried before moving on to the next step. For the next step, we're going to be adding some green tones into the brown mud of this base. And to do this, I'm going to be quite heavily thinning some Loren forest from Games Workshop. And I'm thinning this down almost to a wash consistency. It still wants to have some viscosity like you do a layer, but this is really thin, slightly thicker than a glaze. And what I'm going to do with this is sort of splodge it randomly onto areas onto the texture paint. Once I've got an area that I want to have some green tones to it, I am washing off my brush, and with a wet brush I am smudging and blurring the edges of this paint. We don't want this to be neat, we don't want this to be a uniform blend, we want this to be dirty, loose smudging of paint. And if you really want to refine a tonal difference, you can come back in with some of the mixture of the Loren forest and plonk it into the middle of the areas that you've had green. And I'd recommend covering about 50% of the base, but doing enough in splits of splodges of big areas and little areas so you have a two-tone. As it's dried, you can see it's had a real nice tonal variation, but still looks like mud. The next step is to add some vegetation to the base. And for the first bit of vegetation, I'm using the 10mm swamp grass tufts from Rival Crafts. And I'm sticking to these to the base with a little bit of super glue. So I'm pulling them off with tweezers and then just plonking them onto the base where the super glue is. And these don't take long to dry at all. These are really good. And the reason I'm using these 10mm ones is we want to have some height variation in the other tufts that we're going to use later. And I wouldn't go all out with these, I'd just put maybe one or two on a 30mm base. And if you go down to 25, probably only use one of these. For the next tuft, I'm using a much shorter, darker green tuft, and what I'm just plonking down some super glue splodges where I'm going to be putting these tufts. If you've got a miniature that's going onto these base, I'd advise that you leave space for it to put the miniature's feet or the rock that it's standing on. These are a 4mm summer grass tuft from Rival Scenics. You can use any green tuft you want. I just recommend that it's something of a smaller height than the swamp grass. And if you can, I'd go for a different shade of green, or put some flower tufts in there if you've got them. The reason we want to do this is to really emphasize that this is a vibrant ecosystem and there's a lot of different types of grasses and colors in this swamp. Swamps are really vibrant and green, and there's a whole array of colors. And we really want to show that with the green we put on the base and the tufts that we're applying. And it's just a matter of going around, picking the tufts that you want and sticking them down with some super glue. You can use some tweezers to fluff them out a bit once they're on there, or you can leave them quite straight. Once all my tufts are down, the base looks like this. As you can see, I've left space for a miniature to put its feet, and still enough space that you can see some of the green Loren forest we applied earlier. For the last step, I'll be adding some glisten and wet look effects to the base with some Vallejo water texture. And to do this, I'm taking an old brush, dipping it into the texture, and then applying it to the base. And I'm allowing the texture to sort of run into all the cracks and crevices, and I'm focusing around all the tufts that I have in place. If you don't have a water effects, then you can get away using gloss varnish, but I prefer the finish of the water effects. I wouldn't recommend this for deep pours, however, but it is perfect for uses such as this. And with the water effects in place, this swamp base is now complete. Ready for your games of Warcry, Age of Sigmar or other fantasy miniatures games. If you like this tutorial, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge and it helps me out. So, see you in the next one, folks.